The Chicago Bears are actively pursuing additional help on the defensive line. And even though last year was Yannick Ngakoue's worst season in the NFL, a return to Chicago still would be what's best for both parties.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. On the show today, some renewed interest and reporting in the Bears seeking another edge rusher to help fill out this Bears defensive line. We'll get the latest on what that pursuit looks like and some potential names that have already been thrown out there, including Yannick Ngakoue, who we'll hear from about his offseason so far, remaining a free agent. We'll look at the possibilities and what it might look like with him in a potential return to the Chicago Bears. And we'll wrap up looking more broadly at this defensive line and wondering aloud whether edge rusher is the bigger need than defensive tackle, or how to address this defensive line in the best way possible to give you the best group up front for this Chicago Bears defense. But what really sparks this was some additional reporting from ESPN's Jeremy Fowler that confirms, yes, the Bears are still looking for an edge rusher, which is something I think we all had hoped and maybe even assumed, but I don't think we necessarily knew it to be 100% the case. I don't know that it's been directly reported that, yes, the Bears are still looking for additional defensive line help until now. Fowler pretty much outright saying it. He talked on the ESPN NFL Live podcast, not the TV show, but the podcast version. So I can't play the full audio of what he said, but I do have the actual full quote here from Jeremy Fowler, who said, quote, "They're still looking at edge rusher. They know they probably need one more guy. They love Montez Sweat, DeMarcus Walker, et cetera, et cetera. Free agency is pretty thin. They're sort of waiting to see what develops and see if somebody's available at a good bargain." That was the quote from Fowler. And within those quotes, and as he talked a little bit longer, he mentioned three players in particular. First, he mentioned free agent Tyus Bowser, most recently with the Baltimore Ravens, but didn't play at all last season, and we'll get to that in a minute. Emmanuel Ogbah, most recently of the Miami Dolphins, and then he mentioned the possibility of a return of Yannick Ngakoue. Those were the three names Fowler mentioned specifically in his report. It wasn't like he's saying the Bears are looking at these three guys. He just said free agency is thin. There's this guy, there's this guy, there's this guy. He just mentioned some options. So it's not to say that those are the only three guys the Bears will be looking at, or that the Bears are actively engaged with all three of those guys. No, not necessarily. But interesting that he named those guys and didn't name Calais Campbell, for example, another name we've talked about this offseason, certainly older than any of those other groups. And maybe there's an assumption that Campbell will go back to the Atlanta Falcons, or who knows. But worth noting that Campbell wasn't one of the three names mentioned there. Bowser was the first one, which is a name I don't think we've talked about much this offseason. He's kind of been an afterthought because he missed all of 2023 with setbacks from a knee injury he had suffered in 2022. So he only played 9 games in 2022. It's been like a full season and a half since he's played. Like the next time he plays games will be almost 2 full calendar years since he's been in an NFL regular season game. He's also a little bit more on the outside linebacker body type, lighter side of things. I mean, he's 6'3", 245, 250 is what he's kind of played at, which is tends to be a little bit lighter than where the Bears go for their 4-3 defensive ends, but that's not that far off from where Austin Booker is, and certainly it's not hard for these guys to bulk up a little bit. I don't think that would be the reason to keep the Bears from signing him per se, but obviously the injury thing is much bigger of a question mark there. But we have seen earlier in Bowser's career, I mean, he's never really been like a takeover every snap kind of starter. He did started for a year with Baltimore and had 7 sacks his year as a starter. So we're not talking about some kind of blue chip premier edge rusher, but someone that could come to Chicago and give them another experienced, proven pass rusher at the position that can then take some of the burden off of everyone else and push the depth chart down a little bit and not be relying on guys like Dominique Robinson to be, your number 3 edge rusher, or Austin Booker to have to step up into an even bigger role at that spot. Like, Bowser could absolutely provide that. And I think Emmanuel Ogbah is in a similar boat in terms of the quality of pass rusher we've seen them be. Like, he started early in his career for Cleveland when they drafted him in, was it the first or the second round? Did he come in the second round? It was the first pick of the second round. Okay, that's good. I was glad I was close. And he's been a 5 to 9 sack a year guy. Had a couple of seasons of 9 sacks early on with the Dolphins, but eventually kind of dropped down in that rotation. Had some injuries along the way there, but like last season had 5.5 sacks as kind of their number 3 with Bradley Chubb and can't remember who else is in that, but they have a good Dolphins defensive line that he kind of ended up falling down a few notches in. But he could easily come into Chicago and rotate with DeMarcus Walker and give the Bears that another threat opposite Montez Sweat to not require so much from all those guys. Then there's Yannick Ngakoue, who I think over the course of his career has been the best pass rusher of the 3. He's the only one who's ever hit double-digit sacks, and he's done that a number of times. And over the course of his career, he was always good for at least 8 sacks a season. Until this past year, when he was with the Chicago Bears and had the worst season of his career. And that's what starts to sort of call into question, like, okay, then do you even want to bring him back? How, if you bring back the same guy you got last season, maybe it's not as exciting of an option there. But okay, but is a lesser Yannick Ngakoue still better than Emmanuel Ogbah or Tyus Bowser? Like, I think the worst version of Yannick Ngakoue is not better than the best version of Bowser or Emmanuel Ogbah, but you're not guaranteed to get the worst version of Ngakoue this season. And you're also not guaranteed to get the best version of Bowser or Ogbah either. But I think any of those guys would benefit from lining up opposite Montez Sweat, being able to have DeMarcus Walker in as part of that rotation. And let's not forget a really strong back 7 behind them to really challenge quarterbacks and not leave things open for quarterbacks to be able to, slice and dice all day. Like, it's a good spot for any of these guys to come into. But I do think the fact that it's a good spot makes a lot of sense specifically for a Yannick Ngakoue reunion, that he's still recovering from off-season foot surgery. That was what ended his season last year, was the foot injury, I believe. And so he might not be 100% ready to go today. It's part of why the Bears haven't signed anybody just yet. But between now and training camp, that still feels like the most likely outcome here as the Bears pursue talent at that position, as reported by Jeremy Fowler. So, funny enough, like, as this is all happening, Yannick Ngakoue also did an interview, and just sort of unrelated to Jeremy Fowler's reporting, but kind of with an update on where he's at. So we'll go through what Yannick Ngakoue said and look back at his worst season of his career and how that sort of sets the stage for what we might expect in 2024 next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Gametime, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. Whether you're looking at this Bears schedule and trying to get to a game this season, you can find a great seat at Soldier Field at a great price, because Gametime has all-in ticket pricing, so you're not going to get last-minute fees added to your ticket price that makes it cost way more than you thought once you actually get into checkout. You can also see your view from your seat, so you know exactly what you're getting with your ticket purchase every time. Not just Bears games, but concerts, theater shows, comedy events. I mean, you name it. If there's live entertainment at a big venue in your area, you can find tickets at Gametime. And they've got great last-minute deals as well that can help you save up to 60% off. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Yannick Ngakoue might not be ready to go today, but he's certainly motivated and disappointed with last season and really ready to get back out there and get back to the quality of play we had come to expect throughout his career up to this point, because 2023 was the worst season of Ngakoue's career in almost every single way. At least most of the measurable defensive end metrics all reflect how poorly things went for Yannick Ngakoue. Certainly, like on the first and foremost, like because of the injury, it was the fewest games he played in any season. It's probably the most significant injury. I mean, I guess I don't know his injury history thoroughly, but like certainly missed the most games due to injury, all at the end there because of the foot injury. Like that's on the surface a challenge for a player, especially if he hasn't been through something quite like that. Like, sure, he's been traded during a season before, but not like sidelined by an injury for that many games. As a result, then also the fewest snaps he's ever played in a season, which changes the sample size a little bit, but it's not drastically lower. He's also had seasons fairly close to that. But more importantly, career low in sacks, career low in quarterback hits, career low in quarterback hurries, career low in total quarterback pressures, career low in pressure percentage in terms of like how often, per pass rush snap, how often is he generating pressure? So it's not just a low total, but it's also a low rate of pressure. He generated pressure on the quarterback at the lowest rate of his entire career. It was also a career high in percentage of missed tackles. It wasn't a career high in total missed tackles because he played fewer snaps, but how often he was missing tackles? He missed tackles at the worst rate of his career. Far too many, and made the fewest like stops, tackles for loss in the backfield, like those kind of combined plays, stops against the opponent of any season in his career. Tied a true tackle for loss worst of his career. And it just generally was bad in almost every way. But it's also the anomaly to Yannick Ngakoue's career. We've known that prior to this season, he had never had a season with fewer than 8 sacks. It's why we were so fired up about them signing Ngakoue. It felt like he could be the missing piece to this defensive line. A guy that at a minimum, based on 8 seasons of his career prior, he had 8 straight years, his entire career, of having at least 8 sacks. Some as many as 12 sacks. So we thought 8 to 12 was the range we were going to get from Yannick Ngakoue. And if he had 8 to 12 sacks this season, maybe the Bears don't even end up trading for Montez Sweat at the trade deadline. I mean, that's a wild alternate reality to think about here, where this team would be had Ngakoue actually been better throughout the stretch of that season. But the fact that this one season was his bad season, still leads you to think, okay, he's had 8 great seasons and 1 bad season. What's most likely to happen this year? Is it more likely that he's going to have another bad season, or that he's going to get back to what he's done in the 8 other years of his career? I mean, sure, there's probably a middle ground somewhere in there, but like, I find it a little bit hard to believe that outside of another injury situation, he's not going to be able to bounce back. And certainly I think having experienced this past season this way has lit a fire under Yannick Ngakoue. He did an interview with SiriusXM's NFL Radio. Again, don't have the rights to like play the audio for you here, but the actual quote I can read for you. Ngakoue said, he was asked, about free agency and being a free agent. He said, I haven't really been thinking about an offer or details in specific at all. The only thing I've been thinking about is taking that grass again and reestablishing myself on the field as one of the fiercest competitors in the game today. So that's the only thing on my mind. Everything else will come after that. I have to reestablish myself and remind people of why I'm one of the best rushers. And that's the only thing on my mind. The interviewers tried to follow up and say, okay, but have you had those conversations? Like, have you had talks with teams? And he wouldn't answer that directly. He just, again, kind of reiterated the same thing, like he's working to get back on the field and be ready to go and reestablish himself. But he did express that he wants to be signed by training camp. He said he needs training camp. I think he said all players need training camp to be able to ramp up for the season. So certainly he's looking to sign with the team, maybe not today, maybe not even this month, but by the end of next month, as we get into training camp, Yannick Ngakoue wants to be somewhere. And it still, to me, makes the most sense that he comes back to Chicago. And I think there's good reason to believe the career worst season he had last season is not as likely to repeat. I'm not saying it's impossible, but when you look back at this past season, Montez Sweat came in right before week 9. He was traded to the Bears on October 31st. They played like 2 or 3 days later, and Sweat played week 9. And then after that first game, Ngakoue only played with Sweat 4 more times. And 2 of those times, Ngakoue's snap count was way down. He wasn't on the injury report, but he played about half as many snaps in his last 2 games with the Bears. And so I can't help but wonder if he was hurt earlier than perhaps we knew about. Certainly, like, maybe the injury got worse and then he went on IR, but I wonder if he was dealing with injuries before he went on IR, before he really landed on the injury report. But the point being, he played most of his season last year without Montez Sweat. He didn't have a lot of opportunity to get the Montez Sweat bump. The like, oh, now Ngakoue is not the number 1 pass rusher anymore. Now the offensive line really has to pay a lot more attention to that other guy, and Ngakoue can go do his stuff. Now, there were a couple of games of overlap, and I'll give you, like, in those couple games, Ngakoue didn't dominate, didn't take over, didn't have this big bump up of production necessarily. But like the first 8 or 9 games of the season, it was just him. It was him and Demarcus Walker and Dominic Robinson and Justin Jones and Andrew Billings. But like for the first 8-9 games of the season, Yannick Ngakoue was the number 1 pass rushing threat, and he still should have been better. The Bears needed him to be better. We're counting on him to be better, and he was not. But we didn't get to see Yannick Ngakoue fully healthy with some time to actually work opposite Montez Sweat and get up to speed with all that on the defensive line. And so I just can't help but wonder if that's more reason to think Ngakoue can be better in 2024 with the Bears than he was in 2023 with the Bears, because his Montez Sweat time was just so limited, and I suspect he was dealing with more injuries during some of that Montez Sweat time than perhaps we know about or we were led to believe. And he still did have 4 sacks last season. It wasn't like he was useless either. Just definitely the worst season of his career. And so I think for Ngakoue, Chicago also provides a great opportunity for him where you can plug and play as the starting opposite Montez Sweat. Like, are there very many other teams that are going to be able to offer you this type of a role where you're going to get to play a ton and be as productive as you can be, but also not have to be the number 1 pass rush option and can have Montez Sweat getting all the attention on the other side? Like, if I were trying to reestablish myself the way we heard Ngakoue, or the way I read Ngakoue talking about wanting to, this seems like a good place to do it on a defense that's pretty darn good, but just needs a little bit more on the defensive line, and here he could be that little bit more on the defensive line and kind of what we thought he was supposed to be last season, but now healthier and with even more on the defense. And then, by the way, also a much better offense on the other side than they were last season. So the defense will play, in theory, with more leads, fewer deficits on the scoreboard. The opposing offenses are going to have to pass a little bit more then as a result to try and keep up in games. So you have more pass rushing opportunities, more sack opportunities for Ngakoue to have a 1 year, big year here, and then get that next contract, another multi-year contract. Some of the same things we talked about him doing last season. Because it's important to remember, Ngakoue just turned 29. He's not old. This is not Calais Campbell, who I think is 37 off the top of my head. Yeah, 37, turns 38 during the season. Like, Ngakoue is not over the hill and on the decline. He is still in the prime of his career. So he's not just going to keep declining from here unless the injury situation is just something that he can't get through. But like, he can still have a big season, enter free agency at age 29, turning 30, and cash in a little bit still. And like, so it just feels like it's a good fit. A reunion is a good fit for both sides involved with this, but I certainly wouldn't be upset if they opted for Emmanuel Ogbah or Tyus Bowser. The most important thing is that they do something on this defensive line. I can't help but wonder, though, that if in an ideal world, the addition you make wouldn't be even more needed at defensive tackle, where we all like Gervon Dexter, but like there's not any defensive tackle depth, and it'd be nice to have another body in there, whereas at least at defensive end, you got some guys you like, even if you'd still like to, really you'd like to upgrade both positions. But we'll kind of look at the state of this defensive line and where additions might help out and what might still be needed depending on how they approach this next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own, because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 you can bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. So you can bet $5 on anything. The NBA Finals, the NHL Finals, baseball season, tennis, soccer, boxing, you name it, they've got it all on FanDuel. And if you win, not only do you get the winnings from your $5 bet, but then an additional $150 that you can play with that you could then bet on hey, the Bears week 1 line, I think, is -4.5 over the Titans. You could bet on Caleb Williams' rookie season prop bets, offensive rookie of the year, Roma Odunze's receiving yards. I mean, so many different ways you can play at FanDuel. So to claim your $150 in bonus bets, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Really appreciate y'all making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Don't forget, we also have our 24/7 national sports stream on the Locked On Sports Today YouTube channel. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel for you every day with the biggest stories without all of the screaming and debate television you get on Fox Sports and ESPN. So check out the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 stream on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And as part of your team every day, we've talked a lot about this defensive line this offseason and the need to address it. And I can't help but feel like, when I think about this Bears defensive line, if you had to rank your confidence in the starters 1 through 4, obviously Sweat is 1. I'd probably go Andrew Billings 2, honestly, because the nose tackle, he's a good nose tackle. I mean, nose tackles are limited, but confidence in him at that position is fine. I'd probably go DeMarcus Walker 3 and Gervon Dexter 4. Dexter's got the ceiling, and I'm optimistic and hopeful Dexter can be better, but Dexter hasn't proven very much yet. He hasn't proven to be a consistent player. Walker has at least done it before in Tennessee and flashed it a little bit more last season than Dexter did. But I've got more question marks right now about defensive tackle than defensive end, which makes me feel like sometimes okay, well, wait a minute. Should they be focusing so much on, got to add a defensive end, got to add Ngakoue, got to add Agba, got to add Bowser. One of these edge rushers has got to be the focus in free agency when, even if it's just somebody behind Gervon Dexter, a defensive tackle. Right now you've got Dexter and Byron Cowart and Michael Dwumfor and a couple of undrafted free agents. And then, of course, Zach Pickens is going to play both defensive tackle spots. But, you got 3 defensive tackles you can trust. And I'd like to have a minimum of 4, if not 5, would be ideal. And it'd be nice to get someone who can actually, take some valuable snaps there and not rely on Gervon Dexter to even have to play every key defensive tackle spot in there. So I find myself feeling man, it would be ideal if you could add someone to play defensive tackle. But as we talked about earlier this offseason, the defensive tackle free agent market is even worse than the edge rusher free agent market, which is not particularly pretty. And so we come back to, I think, the approach that the Bears are taking here is to kind of absorb the ripple effect here. That, okay, if you sign Yannick Ngakoue, Tyus Bowser, Emmanuel Agba, take your pick. You sign a defensive end, and presumably that defensive end takes over as the starter opposite Montez Sweat. That bumps DeMarcus Walker to be your number 3 defensive end, but he's going to rotate in as a starter too. He'll kind of split time with this other guy, but it's going to make it so Walker is not an every down, every play defensive end. And then, of course, Dominic Robinson or Austin Booker or Jake Martin can be your 4th defensive end, and everyone just moves down a notch on the depth chart if you add someone at the top next to Montez Sweat. At least if you do that, it does free up DeMarcus Walker to be able to play more defensive tackle, because we know in Tennessee, prior to coming to Chicago, he was very effective at the defensive tackle spot, can play both inside and out. Last season, the Bears, almost more out of necessity, I think, had to use him more as an edge rusher than an interior guy. And the plan was always to use him more as an edge rusher, but I wonder if this season, if they get that other guy, if they will feel more inclined to say, okay, now we can use Walker inside more because we don't need him as much as an edge guy. Because if you think about 2023, when you started the season, your starters were Ngakoue and Walker. So Walker was a starting edge rusher for the first 8 weeks of the season. Then you go out and get Montez Sweat. So then Walker becomes your 3rd defensive end. Okay, now he's freed up a little bit more. But you have Sweat and Ngakoue for 3 or 4 total games before Ngakoue snaps go down and then Ngakoue's out. And once Ngakoue's out, DeMarcus Walker's a starter again opposite Montez Sweat and has to play a full load of defensive end snaps and can't play as much on the interior because you need him on the edge. So there were only a handful of weeks last season where Walker was, freed up to move around more. I mean, they still moved around even in games when he started at defensive end, but he was a little bit more limited to how many snaps he could play elsewhere because they just needed him to play a certain amount of his snaps at defensive end. I went and looked through over the course of last season. He was about 2/3 edge rusher, 1/3 interior players. It was like 65.8% of his snaps were like from the 7 technique and wider, like edge rusher in the 4-3 defense, which means about 1/3 of his snaps were inside that. I wouldn't imagine that the Bears, if they sign Ngakoue or whoever, they sign a defensive end, I don't think the plan would be make DeMarcus Walker a full-time defensive tackle. But I wonder if that 1/3, 2/3 split gets closer to 60-40 edge rusher, 50-50, half of his snaps on the inside, half of his snaps on the outside. Like, allow Walker to be someone who rotates in with Gervon Dexter so that when Dexter needs a break, or if Dexter's struggling a little bit or whatever it might be, you can throw Walker in at that other defensive tackle spot and still have Ngakoue and Montez Sweat on the outside, or Sweat and Agbar, whoever you sign. When you don't have to rely on Walker as that starter, you can move those guys around a little bit more. And you can bring in Austin Booker on the outside opposite Sweat and have Walker. And there's always ways to get Walker inside, but then you have to play someone else at the edge rusher spot. And if you at least invest in another free agent edge rusher on the outside, it gives you more confidence to move Walker inside and trust what you're going to be able to replace him with at the edge spot to provide more defensive tackle depth with one of your defensive ends in lieu of signing a defensive tackle. Because there just aren't a lot of, or really any quality defensive tackles in the free agent market. So I wonder if that's Ryan Poles' approach here. He says, listen, maybe Ryan Poles would love to address defensive tackle, but he just doesn't really see a viable option for a free agent that's really going to solve that problem. You could sign more journeyman end of the roster guys, but that doesn't really solve the problem. It just adds more to what you already have. You already have end of the roster guys. You need something a little bit more consistent. So he says, okay, maybe I can't find that defensive tackle upgrade that I would like, but I can find a defensive end upgrade. So if I upgrade defensive end, then I can also upgrade defensive tackle by moving DeMarcus Walker to play more inside than he did last season without making him a full-time inside player, but being able to utilize his versatility in a way that is going to give the Bears less predictability on the defensive line, attack opposing offensive lines in different ways, and just utilize these skill sets to get the best players on the field at the same time, instead of being forced to just get whoever you can because you only got a couple of reliable players at each of the defensive line spots. That's what I'm guessing the approach is going to be, but we'll see what Ryan Poles has up his sleeve. They certainly have more defensive end depth than defensive tackle depth. I think that bodes well for Walker getting some extra playing time there. But they also just need Gervon Dexter to play well and Zach Pickens to play well and to step up and be better. They are counting on that. If those guys don't, DeMarcus Walker can't shoulder all of that load. It will be a problem if those guys aren't better. And the Bears have invested in coaching, in new defensive line coach as defensive coordinator, same defensive line coach as last year on the defensive line. There's a lot of investment around that spot and time and energy being put into Dexter and Pickens. Let's go. It's your time. And maybe DeMarcus Walker can help out a little bit if they go out and get a defensive end. If and when the Bears do sign another edge rusher, you can be sure we'll break it down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are in the thick of the offseason, but we're not going anywhere for you. We're going to have Bears mandatory mini camp updates this week and so much more before. You know what? We'll be getting ready for training camp and be right back into the swing of the football season. So don't go anywhere, because if you miss an episode of Locked On Bears, then you miss another opportunity to bear down.